Hello and welcome to the Whipple Museum of the History of Science for this live Q&A and tour. My name is Joshua Nall. I'm the Curator of Modern Sciences here in the Whipple. I'm going to lead the Q&A today, but we're actually going to start you with a video tour that we're going to play for you. And that's so that we can actually show you around the museum a bit and move around and show you all 4 galleries of the museum. So while we're playing this video for you, the Q&A will be open and live. So please, if any questions come up, do drop them in. When the video tour is finished, it takes about 15 minutes. We'll come back to me live, and then I can start answering questions, but also talking through some of the objects that I've got out here, which happen to be things that I think are particularly interesting. So we'll start now and go to the video tour. Please do drop some questions and I'll see you in 15 minutes time. Hello and welcome to this moving tour part of today's Alumni Festival event. What I'm going to do now is take the opportunity to walk around the museum a bit and show off all 4 of our galleries and various aspects of the collection and give you a bit of background history about the museum. If there are any objects that I point out or talk about in this tour that you want to know more about, you can ask me about that in the live Q&A that will follow this video. So we're starting here in the museum's main gallery, and it has one of the first things you'll notice, a really beautiful setting, this really stunning Jacobean hammer beam roof hall. So really the best place to start is to give you a little bit of history about the building, because it's a really fortunate that the Whipple Museum has this incredible setting. The room we're in right now was the original Peirce Free School. So Peirce was a fellow of Gonville and Caius, and he endowed this school for the education of local Cambridge boys, and this hall was built between 1618 and 1628. It was then the Peirce School into the 19th century, when eventually that school moved out to other locations, and this hall came into the possession of the university. Up to that point, for most of the history of the time when it was a school, out of these, what would have been very large windows to the side of the room, you would have actually been overlooking the university's botanic garden, which was located on what is now the new museum's site. That all dramatically changed in the 19th century because John Stevens Henslow, one of Darwin's favourite professors, was tasked with moving the botanic garden out to what was then the outside of town to its current location. And this site began to be built up by the university for, as the name suggests, new museums. At that time in the 19th century, the museums were museums of science, and they were not public-facing museums. These were museums for teaching and research. And so that site built up, and it eventually built up and kind of engulfed this beautiful 17th century hall. And eventually, the uses of this room changed. By the late 19th century, it had become part of the university's engineering department. It was used as an electrics laboratory, and then it became a chemistry laboratory, so our front entrance still says School of Physical Chemistry above it. And then in the 1950s, when the chemists moved out of here to Lensfield Road, it got taken over by the Whipple Museum. So the museum has been here since the late 1950s. The collection, we'll see in a minute when we move into the next gallery, was endowed by a man named Robert Stuart Whipple, and it's grown considerably since his original endowment. And we now have a huge range of materials on display here. And so as we move through the gallery, I can point to the diversity of some of these materials. We of course have, standing here in the middle of the gallery, this very beautiful grand orrery. This is a mid-18th century instrument. It's a model of the solar system, and you would actually attach a handle which would attach into the side of this orrery and crank the handle, and it models the relative motions of all of the bodies of the solar system extremely accurately. So while it's not to scale, it would give you a model of the Newtonian universe, or the Newtonian solar system, with correct relative speeds of orbits. If we keep moving, we of course have some classic scientific instruments on display, like astrolabes. We have a nice wide range of astrolabes, and I'll have an astrolabe out for the live Q&A to show you if anyone has any questions about them. We have a range of materials relating to the history of astronomy, telescopes, models again, also microscopes. Whipple was particularly keen on collecting microscopes, as you'll see, and we have a very wide range of microscopes. This is obviously one of our star objects, a really beautiful 10-foot reflecting telescope. This telescope was made by William Herschel, the discoverer of Uranus, and it was gifted by Herschel to the king, and the king then gifted it to Blenheim Palace, and it came to the museum when the museum was founded. We've also got more mundane objects, but objects that are really interesting as research objects for the history of science. So we have, for example, a wonderful selection of different models. So these are models of horses' teeth. If anyone wants to know why we have models of horses' teeth, you can ask me that in the Q&A. And these are the kinds of objects that often become the focus of research projects for students here in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science. The museum is inside the department, so we always try and get students, whether they're undergraduates or masters or PhD students, to come through and do some research on material in the collection. So we're going to move next to the exhibitions gallery, and I'll see you in there. So welcome to our special exhibitions gallery. This is the space in which we put on rotating special exhibitions. And the exhibition we have in here is actually a celebration of our 75th anniversary. So the museum was effectively established in the autumn of 1944, when Robert Stuart Whipple bequeathed his entire collection of scientific instruments, about 1,100 instruments, and an equivalent number of antiquarian books to the university on the condition that it establish a museum for the history of science. So who was Whipple? Well, Whipple was a local industrialist, a businessman. He was the director of the Cambridge Scientific Instrument Company. So if you follow me, I can show you some of the materials that we have relating to the instrument company. Some of you may even know or be familiar with instruments from the Cambridge Scientific Instrument Company, because founded in 1881, by the early 20th century, they had grown to be one of the country's leading manufacturers of laboratory instrumentation. And we actually have the largest extant collection of Cambridge instrument material in this museum. We have lots of stuff. And you can see the diversity here of the kind of instruments they made, things like microtomes for preparing microscope specimens, specialist industrial thermometers, dip circles, things like galvanometers for very sensitive electrical experimentation. So Whipple was really an important part of building the firm from its beginnings, making specialist laboratory instrumentation, mostly for labs here in Cambridge. By the mid-20th century, it was a very, very large company producing a lot of instruments. It had factories in London, in Ossining, New York, and it was producing material not just for labs, but for industry, the military, etc. And so Whipple became very, very successful, and he started collecting historic scientific instruments. And we have, if we just rotate round here, the very first instrument that Whipple bought. This is accession number 1. It's a very handsome 18th century telescope. And with this telescope, we also always associate it with a quote. When Whipple gave his bequest to the university, he gave a speech. And in that speech, he said, "I little thought when I bought an old telescope for the sum of 10 francs from an antique shop in Tours in 1913 that I was embarking on the slippery slope of collecting, a slope which leads one to many strange places and has been known to lead to financial disaster. I have been spared the latter trouble and have had much fun," unquote. So Whipple starts 1913, he buys this telescope, and by 1944, he has over 1,000 instruments. This gallery, therefore, displays only a portion of the many, many things that Whipple acquired during his time as a collector. So in this case, for example, we have what we call treasures of the Whipple collection. This is some of the finest pieces that he acquired. Sometimes we say fine because they're incredibly rare. For example, this exquisite mariner's compass, Portuguese from 1711. Very few of this form of early mariner's compass survive because they're very fragile and they tended not to survive their journeys or the lives of the ships that they were put on. Sometimes we say fine because they're obviously very exquisite works of art, like this extraordinary universal sundial. And sometimes they're fine because they're particularly unusual or rare. So I'll have this out for the live Q&A, but this is what we think is probably the oldest known surviving armillary sphere, which is a model of the universe, a geocentric model of the universe. This one dates, we think, from at latest 1450, so it may be the oldest known to survive. And also we have some of the more interesting and or mundane things that Whipple acquired. So we have kind of curios, like a globe, which is actually folds up and down like an umbrella, or something that Whipple seemed to be very interested in, he collected a lot of, which is spectacles and opera glasses, which are not the kinds of things that we would typically display in a History of Science museum, but actually Whipple recognized them as part of the history of the optical instrument trade, and so he collected a wide variety. So that's all I'll say for now about Whipple and his collection. This exhibition will continue up into 2022, so hopefully you'll have an opportunity to come and see it. Next, we'll move briefly into our learning gallery. Hello, and so welcome to the learning gallery. So this is the space in which our learning coordinator teaches classes with school groups that are visiting. And it's also a public gallery space where we focus on some of the materials that we have in the collection that specifically relate to the education of science. So we have a range of materials for teaching and learning, things like this wonderful model of the frog, which was used in the zoology department to teach students anatomy, and also rare survivals. One of my favorite pieces in the museum, one of the less beautiful pieces, but historically more important, I think, is this fume cupboard. Now, this fume cupboard comes from Newnham College. It dates to the turn of the 20th century. And it comes from Newnham College's own chemistry laboratory. And the reason that Newnham had a chemistry laboratory at the turn of the 20th century was that women were not granted access to the other chemistry laboratories in the men's colleges of the university. So if you wanted to study experimental chemistry at Cambridge and you were a woman, you had to go to Newnham's dedicated laboratory, which was resided over by the first tenured professor of chemistry here in Cambridge, Ida Freund, tenured female professor of chemistry here, Ida Freund, who taught right through until chemistry classes were integrated after the First World War. So finally, we're just going to quickly move on up to our globes gallery. I'll see you there. So now we're in the museum's globes gallery. The Whipple has a particularly fine collection of historic globes, but not just terrestrial globes. We've got a lot of celestial globes as well, and my personal favorite, we have a lot of planetary globes. So you can see in this case, behind here, we've got globes of Jupiter, of Venus, of Mercury, and my favorite is the many globes that we have of the planet Mars. And these globes range in date from the early 1870s through a period when Mars was mapped only through telescopic sight, and therefore the maps of the planet varied quite dramatically over a period from the 1870s through to the early 20th century, when you start to see globes, for example, like this one, which has canals all over it. And then finally, we have globes after the space age, when probes begin to be sent out to Mars and send back much more detailed examples. So you can find in this gallery many, many examples of these kinds of globes, but also globes of the moon, planetary models, all kinds of things. And if you want to know more about these, I'll have this globe out for us for the Q&A. And you can ask me about that or about any of the other things that I've talked about today. So I'll see you now at the live Q&A. Hello and welcome back. I hope that tour was informative and gave you, those of you who've not visited us, a view of the museum here. As I explained in that tour, we're inside the Department of History and Philosophy of Science. We're right in the center of town on Free School Lane. And I hope that some of you at least will be able to come back and visit us soon. We are now back open to the public Monday through Friday. So check our website for details of times and how to book in free tickets. So now I'm going to turn to a bit of a live Q&A and talk you through some of the interesting objects that we have here on this table. I've got some questions in front of me, so I'm going to start with them. Jackie has asked, why do we have a cabinet of models of horses' teeth? Very good question. One of the more common questions we get asked, our Twitter avatar is actually that picture of the horse's teeth. And it's not immediately obvious why anyone would have a large cabinet that looks like a briefcase full of something like 40 different sets of horses' teeth. Those of you who know horses and know a bit about horses might have a guess as to why this is. The models are from 1890, so late 19th century, and they're made of papier-mâché, a very special mix of papier-mâché developed by a French anatomist named Louis-Jérôme Auzout. And in the 1830s, 1840s, Auzout realized that there was a gap in the market for anatomical models for use in teaching. And he started with human anatomical models. And he developed a secret proprietary recipe to make really robust papier-mâché. And what that meant was that he could mass produce anatomical models that could then be used in teaching at a time when anatomy students were starting to find access to cadavers was becoming limited in large part because of introduction of laws that were tightening and restricting the way in which cadavers could be accessed to try and prevent things like grave robbing. So Auzout starts with anatomy models, but then the firm becomes very successful and it branches out and it starts making teaching models that are zoological and botanical. And this museum has a wide collection of Auzout models. We've got plants, we've got fruits, and we've got lots of different animals. Some of them are things like we have this wonderful May beetle that's massively enlarged. And the point is that you can fully take it apart and study the internal anatomy. But the horse's teeth are a little bit different than that. They're not, strictly speaking, for teaching a zoologist horse anatomy. They're more practical than that. And the reason is that you can age a horse by looking at its teeth. So what that cabinet actually contains is an example of what a typical horse's teeth look like, ranging from 24 hours after birth to 30 to 40 years old. And so the kit was designed to give to those who were involved in the acquisition of horses, to teach them how to age a horse by looking in its mouth. What's wonderful about the set, and one of the things that I particularly like, is that not only does it have this set showing all of the different ages, it also has some examples of what it looks like when an unscrupulous horse dealer has actually filed down a horse's teeth to try and make it look younger than it actually is. So it's a practical set, and obviously the date 1890, this is from a time before the invention of the automobile, when the horse was ubiquitous in commercial and urban environments as a mode of transport. So buying and selling horses was big business. So having a kit like this could, in principle, help you avoid being scammed. The second question I've got, Shelley asks, that was a very specific question. Shelley asks a very general question. Shelley asks, from a broader perspective, why is the history of science important? So there are lots of different answers I can give to this. And obviously, as a historian myself, I can give the answer that every historian gives, which is that history is really important to study just as a way of understanding the human condition, understanding society and how society works over time so that we might apply those lessons in the present. History of science in particular is interesting in this respect because obviously some people might think, well, science, it's not like politics. One of the things that we teach in this department is that actually science is like all other human activities. It's a social activity, it's a practical activity, as we'll see here. And therefore, what we teach, and particularly we teach, most of the undergraduates who I teach are natural science students. So they're taking history and philosophy of science as part of their broader natural science studies. And one of the things that we're keen to teach them is to explain to them and to show to them that science is a social activity and a practical activity, and therefore it's perhaps not quite as clean and objective as typical accounts of science may have you believe. And the history of science is very good for showing that because, of course, one of the things that the history of science is full of is stories of error and mistake. And so we have lots of devices in this museum that at their time were treated as completely credible science, but now we would judge as completely pseudoscientific. So one example, simple example, we have a lot of electromedical devices from the 19th and early 20th century, when a lot of practicing medical practitioners argued that you could treat all kinds of conditions by giving people electric shocks. This is now judged to be completely pseudoscientific, but these devices themselves, we wouldn't, as historians, judge pseudoscientific because at the time they were taken seriously. The other example I can give, which I spoke to very briefly in the tour, is something that I actually did my PhD research on and then wrote a book about, which is debates about extraterrestrial life on Mars. So I showed you those Mars globes. And those globes dated from about the 1870s through to the 1910s. And this was a period where a lot of astronomers were arguing about whether or not there was life on Mars. Now, this might seem ridiculous or fantastical to us now, but this was a very serious debate. And one of the things that I looked into as I explored this story is the way in which the kinds of media and materials that were available to astronomers influenced the way in which they practiced and talked about astronomy. So one of the arguments of my book is that new forms of mass media that were available to astronomers in the late 19th century influenced the way they actually practiced astronomy and talked about Mars, because questions about canals on Mars was a very popular topic in the newspapers. And I argued that this influenced in significant ways the way that astronomers worked. So that kind of story, I hope, teaches the next generation of natural scientists that actually they have to understand that they are parts of wider society, they can be influenced by wider society, and also that science isn't always perfect and correct, that you can make mistakes, and that science improves and gets better over time. So it's not a criticism. But I hope that is somewhere towards an answer to that quite general question. Charlie Draper asks, is the Herschel 10-foot telescope complete with speculum mirrors, and do you ever try observing with it? We do have the original mirrors. So the way that the telescope is structured is that you have a curved reflecting mirror at the bottom end of this long tube, which reflects and focuses light back up to the top. And the observer, therefore, looks in at the top end of the tube. Now, we don't continue to try and observe with it, and there's a very good reason why we don't, which is that the mirror that William Herschel used and made is not actually a form of mirror that is typically used now. Typically now we would use a silvered glass mirror, and those mirrors tend to remain pretty reflective over time. Whereas Herschel was actually using a solid alloy, a solid piece of metal, which he polished. The metal is called speculum, and speculum has the advantage that if you polish it up, it's very reflective. But the problem is that speculum tarnishes over time with exposure to air. So Herschel, when he was using a telescope like that, would have to polish his mirror before every use. And so he actually, in his house in Bath, he actually had a whole room dedicated to making and polishing mirrors. So while we have the speculum mirror in here, it's now no longer very reflective, and we don't have the skills and the expertise needed to polish it up and get it back into reflective form. So we can still study it for its size and its shape and its composition, and that can tell us about Herschel's working practices, but we can't unfortunately use it ourselves. So the next question will actually give me a chance to kind of throw to some of the objects on the table. We have a question from an attendee asking, what object are you most surprised to have found in the museum? And on this table, I have one of the objects that I think for a lot of people, they find the most surprising to have found in this museum. And that's these. And I will hold up some of these for you to look at, if you can zoom in on those. And you can even see here, good old Woolworth colored geometry sets. So these are, of course, mathematical protractors. And the question becomes, why do we have cheap plastic mathematical protractors, the kind of things that you could buy at Woolworths or even at a corner shop? Surely these aren't treasures of the history of science. Well, actually, these particular protractors tell a really fascinating story, and that's why we have them. What happened was that about, I would say, 5 to 10 years ago, a retired mathematics teacher approached us, and he had a story. He said, I'd like to donate to you some protractors, but they're unusual. They're faulty protractors. They are protractors that do not work. And if you look at this protractor, again, if you want to zoom in, you might begin to see why these particular protractors don't work. And the answer is that they're made of solid plastic. They're opaque. You can't see through them. If you remember your school protractor from when you were in school, certainly if you're of my age, that protractor was made of clear plastic. And there's a good reason, because you've got to put the crosshairs at the center of the protractor on the corner of the angle that you're trying to measure. So this is completely unusable. And the story the maths teacher had to tell was a campaign that he waged over more than a decade to try and eliminate shops selling unusable protractors, because what he found was he had students coming to school, to his maths class, having bought protractors in Woolworths that they then couldn't use. So he donated us not only all of the unusable protractors that he had collected over many years as a maths teacher, but he also donated to us a stack of letters, it's about this thick, of his letter writing campaign to try and get shops to stop selling faulty protractors. So there's letters to Woolworths, there's letters to W.H. Smith's, but there's also letters to the importing companies that are bringing these in and selling them to Woolworths. And then there's letters ultimately to the factories in places like China that were manufacturing these devices. So from what seems like a ridiculously humble object that you wouldn't think you would have in a museum, you end up having a very interesting story about mathematics and this one maths teacher's campaign to eradicate these devices. And the coda to the story is that he said to us when he made this donation that by the end of his letter writing campaign, which was kind of late 1990s, early 2000s, that he had begun to see that these kinds of opaque protractors were no longer available. And he stopped his campaign, he felt, having been broadly successful in eliminating their sale in the UK at least. So back to some questions. A great question here from Anne. How often do you acquire new exhibits? Are they always donations? Excellent question. We normally make probably somewhere between, in a given year, 20 to maybe 100 new acquisitions a year. So a reasonable amount, sometimes more, sometimes less. So Whipple's original donation was about 1,100 objects. The museum now has somewhere in the range of 8,000 discrete accessioned items. A lot of those, but not all of them, come in as donations. So when the museum was first set up, we got a lot of donations and loans from the Cambridge colleges, who had all kinds of materials that they, of course, had been holding on to. But once there was a central history of science museum, they could donate or loan into us at the Whipple. And then since then, lots of people have donated pieces to us for all kinds of reasons. But we do also acquire through purchase. One of the things that Robert Whipple did when he gave his founding donation is that he also gave a bequest, which was to be used to expand and augment the collection. So he recognized when he made the donation to the university that it would be helpful if there was money available to grow the museum. So we are able to purchase pieces. So sometimes we can acquire things at auction. We can purchase them. To throw to a device that's worth talking about that is an example of how we acquire material into the collection, I think it would be a good idea to talk to you for a little moment about Charles Darwin's desk microscope. So if we can zoom in here on this beautiful piece. So this is a mid-19th century desk microscope. It was acquired by Charles Darwin in the late 1840s. So I'll tell you the story of our acquisition of it first, and then I'll go back and give you the story of Darwin's use of it. So the reason that we have Charles Darwin's microscope is that Darwin, in old age, gave it to his son, Francis Darwin. Now, Francis Darwin, by the time that he donated it to his son, was a professor of botany here at the University of Cambridge. And so when Francis Darwin retired, he left it behind in the botany school. And many years later, it was found in a cupboard in the botany school. And at that point, people weren't exactly clear what it was. It was obviously an old microscope, but there was one telling clue. This old microscope had been sitting in a cupboard, and it was covered in a silk dust sheet. And the silk dust sheet had a monogram in the corner that read CD. And someone in the botany school put two and two together and realized that that might be Charles Darwin, and did some digging and figured out that, yes, indeed, this was a device that Francis Darwin had left behind when he retired. So they contacted us and said, we've discovered what we think is Charles Darwin's microscope. And it was then donated into the Whipple Museum, what we call a transfer from a department into the museum, another way that we acquire plenty of objects. So the story itself of the microscope is also very fascinating. It's been heavily researched since we acquired it. We actually were able to find not only the microscope, but I'll show you here some of Charles Darwin's own notes and letters on the use of the microscope were then recovered as having survived. So I'm just going to fold these out. So these are notes in Darwin's hand, which describe details of how to use the microscope. So in the middle here, for example, we've got an explanation of how to use a micrometer for measuring small distances based on the kind of magnification that's being used. So these are kind of notes and aid memoirs to himself so that he can use this microscope effectively. So the story of Darwin's use is, I don't have time to go into it in detail, but really the important thing to know about it is that after Darwin came back from his voyage on the Beagle, when he'd been on the Beagle, he had used a small pocket microscope. But once he was settled back in England, he decided that he needed a much more powerful microscope to use in his zoological studies, and specifically his study of barnacles. Through most of the 1840s, Darwin dedicated himself to a very detailed study of barnacles, which was ultimately published in the early 1850s in 2 volumes. And this study of barnacles was actually really important for Darwin, both because it made his reputation as a zoologist. Before then, his reputation had mainly been as a travel writer, and as a geologist. But Darwin was keen to transition more into zoological study, and it was this study of barnacles that made his reputation. He won a Royal Society Gold Medal for the book he published. But it's also important for understanding the development of Darwin's ideas about evolution by natural selection. One of the important things that he discovered in his study of barnacles was a crucial understanding of the transition or the development amongst species of two-sex reproduction. So one of the classic challenging problems of trying to understand how species might change or develop is how do you get from simple to complex systems in biology. And one of the classic examples is how do you get from single-sex reproduction, from cellular reproduction or hermaphroditic reproduction to two-sex reproduction. And what Darwin found was he found certain species of barnacle where the barnacle itself, what looked to be the barnacle proper, was appeared to be single-sex, but he actually found that that barnacle was always a female, and attached to it were very small, what he called complementary males, which were a very early form of development of a male type of barnacle. So it gave him a sense of how you might develop something like two-sex reproduction over time. So a very important instrument and a very important device. And it goes back to our previous discussion about the importance of understanding science as a practice, as a practical art. I think Darwin in particular is often just thought of as a theorist who sat in a chair and thought these ideas up. Not true at all. Darwin was a very practical scientist. He did a lot of work with the microscope. So back to some questions. So Shanti has asked about the fungi models made of glass and whether these are used for teaching. So you may have seen on my tour, when I showed you the horse's teeth, in the cabinet next to the horse's teeth is one of my favorite displays in the museum. And it's a display of handmade models of microfungi. So these models are about 400 times enlarged, and they are models of what certain kinds of fungi look like through a microscope. And they're handmade of glass. And they're made by a mycologist here who is working here in the middle of the 20th century at the university, named Dylan Weston. And Dylan Weston realized that there were a lot of fungi that he was studying as a mycologist, which were very difficult to represent just by drawing them or putting down on paper what he was seeing through the microscope. So he taught himself to blow glass and to model in glass, and he produced these exquisite models. Do we use them in teaching? Well, yes, I use a huge range of material here in the museum for teaching. We're very keen to have the students who come through the department, be that undergraduate NATSCI students or our MPhil students or our PhD students. We're very keen to have them come through and work with and study and look at the collection. So I teach classes here in the museum. I teach seminars on how to do research on objects. I give lectures on various aspects of the history of science that I happen to know about. And more broadly, I give tours and classes that explain the kinds of objects we have and what they can tell us about the history of science. And absolutely, whenever I give a tour and I talk through the museum and its collection, I often stop at the glass models and talk about them. And one of the reasons we know about them is that we actually had an MPhil student about 10 years ago, and she wrote her dissertation research project on Dylan Weston and the fungi models. So we now have this very rich body of work that I can read and draw on and then use for teaching. Simon has asked, does the museum have any Copernican books such as De Revolutionibus? We do. Robert Whipple was both a collector of instruments and a collector of books. When he made his donation to the university in 1944, he donated about 1,100 instruments and about 1,400 antiquarian science books. So there is a Whipple Museum, which is where I'm standing, but right next door, there is a Whipple Library. And the Whipple Library is both a working teaching library for our students, so it has brand new books, but it also has this exquisite collection of antiquarian books, which you can make an appointment to view with the librarian. And we do have a copy of De Revolutionibus because Whipple collected that amongst his various pieces that he collected. We have a first edition of Darwin's On the Origin of Species. We have a first edition of Newton's Principia. So it's an exquisite collection, and it was a collection that Robert Whipple put together when he was collecting between the 1910s and the 1940s. And he had an excellent taste, so it's a really wonderful collection. Colin has asked, I may have missed this, but what is the oldest object you have in the museum? This is an excellent question, and it actually gives me an opportunity to talk about two pieces that we have on this table today, because I got out two of our oldest pieces. Technically, the simple answer to that is an object that we actually have on loan to the Fitzwilliam. We actually have in this gallery, we have a Roman sundial. So that's comfortably the oldest thing, but it doesn't actually belong to us. And also, I like to really focus on the medieval pieces that we have, which I think are particularly exquisite in terms of understanding and talking about the early history of science. And these are the two important pieces. So I'm going to hold them up. So this is an armillary sphere. So this is a model of the universe. The wooden ball at the center is the Earth, which sits stationary and upright. And then these metal armillaries model the celestial sphere. So they model an imagine a big glass sphere that surrounds the Earth. And onto that sphere, you can dot the position of all of the fixed stars. And then you can start to break that sphere up into sections. You can break it up into tropics. And then you can have a thick band here, which is called the band of the ecliptic, which models the motion of the sun over the course of a year. So in this geocentric model, you can rotate the celestial sphere around the Earth, because of course the Earth is stationary and static in the middle. And you can also rotate the band of the ecliptic, which will tell you information about the position of the sun. So this is effectively a model, and it's a model that could be used for teaching and understanding the structure of the universe. At the latest, we think this dates from about 1450. I think it probably more realistically dates from about 1400. So it's one of the very earliest pieces in the museum. And what's particularly special about it is that we don't make this claim definitively, but we think it's the oldest surviving armillary sphere in the world. So it's the oldest surviving physical model of the universe in this form. And Robert Whipple, just to give you a sense of Whipple and his excellent tastes, Whipple bought this for £12 in an antique shop in London in the 1920s. And when he bought it, he didn't really know anything about it. He wasn't able to study it in the way that we can and do the kind of analyses we can. So he didn't know how old it was, but he thought it was an interesting thing. And it turns out to have been one of his most important acquisitions. Very similar vintage is this Astrolabe. So this Astrolabe, again, dates from about 1450, we think. It's English. An astrolabe is an astronomical calculating device. It's not totally dissimilar from the armillary sphere, but instead of giving you a physical model that you can teach with, the astrolabe gives you a physical device that you can calculate with. I can't really, in the time we have remaining, explain exactly how it works. So I'll try and give you the kind of cliff notes of how an astrolabe works. What you have is a device which has the celestial sphere projected in lines onto a flat surface that's in the background. And on top of that, you have this intricate net, which is called a rete. And the point of each of these little curls is the position of a prominent star, a bright star in the night sky. So you've got a model of the stars, and then you can rotate the stars over the background celestial sphere. This enables you, and then you've got a band here, which is the position of the sun. And this therefore enables you to actually calculate things like your local time. You can identify a star, but by making observations of the altitude of the sun and the stars using this sighting device on the back, you can actually set your rete to your current positions, and from that you can calculate things like local time, true north, or things like the time that the sun will rise and set at a given date in the future. So it's a very practical device, and this is a really exquisite example that we have that survives to us. So those are two of the oldest pieces. So we don't have a huge amount more time, but I'm going to tackle one or two more questions. Anthony Bell asks, what was the electron microscope next to the Newnham fume cupboard? Excellent spot, Anthony. That's one of my prized acquisitions that when I was here as a curator quite early on, I was called up by a company that works just outside of Cambridge, and they are a specialist company that produces very, very high-end metal alloy products, things like fan blades for jet engines. And so they were using this electron microscope to analyze the alloy composition of these fan blades. But they explained to me that the technician who ran the machine was retiring. And so they were going to have to retire the machine with him because the machine was so old that it was now superseded by much smaller, newer equipment. And he proceeded to tell me the backstory, which was fascinating, which is that's one of the first electron microprobes produced in Cambridge. It's both able to image as an electron microscope and analyze using X-ray backscatter radiation to give you very precise alloy compositions. The original of this design was developed in the Cavendish laboratory in the 1960s. And prototype examples were developed in the Cavendish. Then they spun out a company to commercially produce the design. I think they were called something like, I want to say Tube Investments, something like that. And that company started to produce them commercially. And this is one of the very first examples that they produced. So late 1960s, early 1970s. And it ended up being acquired by this company that worked with metals and used for many years successfully. But as it was being retired, they said, would we like it? And of course, with this wonderful backstory that links it all the way back to pioneering work in the Cavendish, we said, absolutely, we would love to have it, even though it has to be confessed, it's very big and it takes up a lot of space. The director of the museum does remind me occasionally that I can't say yes every time someone rings me up and offers me a very large bit of equipment. But that was just such a good piece that we couldn't resist. So Sharad Pandian, an ex-MPhil in this department, I should say. I've taught Sharad. Hello, Sharad. What is the largest object now or in the past? Well, the microprobe is one of them. Probably the heaviest and the most cumbersome piece we have is not actually out on display at the moment. It's one of my favorite pieces, which is what's called a dividing engine. It weighs many tons. It's absolutely huge. It's really difficult. You need about 12 people to move this device around. It dates from about 1800. And it's a device for very precisely graduating scales on any instrument that's used for measuring angles has to have a divided scale. So you can see on an Astrolabe, a very primitive form of this round the edge, the scale is divided into 360 divisions. By 1800, they actually built machines that could do this mechanically. And we have this dividing engine. And it's an absolute beast. But I always like to take students down to show them because it's a classic example of a kind of industrial revolution solution to a scientific problem, which was that the hand division of scales around the edge of devices for measuring angular distance was actually a complicated problem to solve. Because if you do it by hand, it takes a long time, and therefore you can only produce a very small number of instruments. And these kinds of instruments were important for things like navigating. The sextant is a classic example of an instrument essential for use at sea to help find position. So the development of this machine was one of the important stories of the development of British naval power at sea. I've only got a couple of minutes, so I'll look at the last couple of questions. Andrew said, please, could you explain the use of the Astrolabe? Well, I hope I've done that already, Andrew. Apologies that I can't do it in more detail. But I hope that I've given you at least a précis of how a device like the Astrolabe works. And then we've got Simon here who asks, what proportion of your collection is on display? How often do you rotate exhibits? Excellent question. I would say somewhere between 5 to 10% of our collection is on display. As I said, we've probably got some in the region of 8 to 10,000 accessioned objects. So yes, we do rotate displays. We try and rotate them fairly regularly. This room we consider to be a bit more permanent, although we do still rotate displays. You can't see it, but over to my left, for example, we have a display case dedicated to called recent acquisitions. So we try and rotate that at least once a year, showing the materials that we've recently acquired. And then sometimes we have small displays, and we try and rotate them. But the special exhibition gallery I showed you, that is obviously a completely new exhibition that we do. And we try and do those once every couple of years because those are a lot of work. And the thing that I will stress to you that I think makes the Whipple particularly special is that we're a tiny team. There's only 6 of us who work here in the museum. So we do a lot with a very small number of people. But we are a small museum, so we can't have the kind of constant special exhibitions that some bigger museums have, but we do try and rotate them. So hopefully if you've been here previously, when you come back, there's plenty of new things for you to see. So that is probably an excellent point for me to wrap up. I will finish just by reminding you that we are open to the public. At the moment, we are open Monday through Friday, 2 till 3:30 p.m. And you need to, well, ideally, we would like you to pre-book tickets so that we can know about numbers and manage people and flow. But we are accepting people on a walk-in basis so long as we're not at capacity. We are also looking into expanding our opening hours back towards pre-COVID levels when we used to be open for the whole of the afternoon. But please do check our website and check our Twitter page if you're planning to visit, because that will give you all of the up-to-date information on how to visit. So that's it from me. Thank you all for your attention. I hope this has been enjoyable, and do enjoy the rest of the Alumni Festival.